We've all heard of carbon footprints. They're all over the place in the press at the moment, but how do you actually measure them? Let's take a look. So how do we actually go about measuring a carbon footprint? Well, we use something called tons of CO2 equivalent, or TCO2e. Well, the tons of CO2 is quite straightforward. It's how many sort of tons of CO2 that you put into the atmosphere. And to think about it, I mean, it's difficult, isn't it? Because CO2 is a gas, and what does a gas look like? Well, the easy way to remember it is a ton of CO2 fills roughly an Olympic-sized swimming pool. So that's kind of what you're talking about. Just think of a swimming pool full of gas, CO2, that's what you get, okay? But what's the E on the end? So it's TCO2e, tons of CO2 equivalent. Well, heat comes down from the sun, hits the surface of the Earth and gets bounced back up, and then normally a lot of that just goes straight out to space, but it bounces off all the pollutants that get trapped in the upper atmosphere. And one of those is CO2. So it comes down, bounces back down and gets re-reflected down, which is causing this heating effect, according to all the sort of climate change problems we've got at the moment. And CO2 does that, but so do other things. So methane, for example, does it. Sulfur hexafluoride, more on that later. And then my old favourite, and I've got to read this in my book, so my apologies, but chlorodifluoromethane. So chlorodifluoromethane, otherwise known to the people who know it and love it as HCFC22, which is known as R22, and you're thinking, well, what the hell's that? It's the stuff that's most common in your air conditioning system, okay? And it's pretty nasty stuff. So the heat comes down from the sun, hits the Earth's surface, gets reflected back, and all these different things build up, all these pollutants build up, and then reflect the heat back down. So to measure our sort of state of the atmosphere, we'd have to measure all of these different things, and there's a long list of them. So what someone decided to do, and it was a really good idea, by the way, whoever came up for this deserves a gold star, is that they put everything in terms of how bad it is compared to CO2. So let's take an example. Take sulfur hexafluoride, for example. Every ton of sulfur hexafluoride in the atmosphere is as bad as having 23,500 tons of CO2. It's really bad stuff, okay? So if you've got a ton of sulfur hexafluoride, we don't write down 1 ton of sulfur hexafluoride. We write down, well, that's equivalent to 23,500 tons of CO2. So if we had a leak, for example, of half a ton of sulfur hexafluoride, we could say that we've got the equivalent of 11,750, that's half of 23,500. So we've got 11,750 tons of CO2, equivalent leak. And that we write that down in the footprint as air conditioning leaks, sulfur hexafluoride, 11,750 tons of CO2. So you'd see a long list of things, but all expressed in how much they equate to CO2. And that allows us to add it up. That allows us to give you one number for example, your carbon footprint of a company, and one number for the carbon footprint of this and that and the other, and not many different numbers, okay? And it just means it's easier to work with. I mean, the problem's hard enough as it is, let alone sort of making it complex with a long list. So we have 1 ton of CO2 equivalent, or TCO2 equivalent, and that's what we use to measure carbon footprints. So most, well, not all rather, so all carbon footprints are measured in TCO2e. So the question is, what's an average emission? Okay, so, and I've got some written down, which I'm going to have to read, I'm afraid. But a good way to think about it is a typical family in the UK generally emits about 10 tons of CO2 a year. All our SME clients around about 10 tons ish. You know, sometimes it's 20, sometimes it's 5, but that kind of number of emissions per year. But the bigger companies, and I've got a table here from, so this is in Net Zero for Business, available on Amazon. If you want to leave it a good review, then you'll be my favorite friend. So Amazon, Net Zero for Business. So the bad ones in here. This is from 2020. Walmart was the worst, 21.5 million tons of, no, sorry, it's not the worst by a long shot. Walmart, 21.5 million metric tons of emissions. So that's 21.5 million tons of CO2. The State Grid Corporation of China, bless their cotton socks, 1876. So 78 million tons of CO2. Amazon in 2020, 61 tons. What else have we got down here? BP, 55 million tons of CO2. Toyota, 46 million tons of CO2. And of course, Toyota getting all sort of problems with their emissions reporting and their emissions sort of their emissions work, shall we say, let's keep it like that. And Shell, 71 million tons. So, there are a few people there who emit really a lot of CO2. But broadly speaking, we measure in tons CO2 E. The E wraps up all the other pollutants, and it means we can just measure it in one number. Typically, customers of ours, about 10 tons per year of emissions for SMEs. More than that if you're a larger company. And saw one yesterday at 2,500 tons. It's not unusual, that sort of size of emissions, and it depends what your company does, of course. And the idea is we measure those, we wrap it all up, we give you a measure, or you get a measure of your carbon footprint, and of course the next job is how do you reduce it down. Okay, so I hope that was useful. If it was, please think about buying the book. Shoot yourself over to Amazon, and if you want to give a good review, that would be fantastic. All right, see you next time.